Little modest negative reaction this morning to Alphabet's numbers, although yesterday the stock was up 2%. So maybe not to get too overexcited about the magnitude of the move, but it seems like there's this kind of constant and louder question around Google, which is great core business. They seem to be spending a lot in terms of investing for the future. When do investors kind of see the harvesting phase? Is that where we're at?
Yeah, I mean, I think the concern right now is Ruth Porat was brought in as CFO a couple of years ago to instill a level of spending discipline, and we just didn't see that in the quarter's results, right? You saw R&D up 40%, CapEx up more than 60%. But on the other hand, those investments clearly are supporting the growth story. Growth up 22%, mostly organic. I think the story is intact, and I think people are selling on the news.
Wasn't the reorg, though, about, to the extent you thought there was going to be discipline, if you think there's discipline on the spending, it was to actually break out some of that spending?
Yeah, I mean,
to actually see where it is.
Right, more transparency. But when she was brought in, I think people expected kind of more thoughtfulness around the spending. And a 60
Do you think it's not thoughtful?
I think that it's less thoughtful than people might have expected.
So, Scott, let me push you on that. Shouldn't we now embrace the fact that when it comes to technology, it's as if you've pressed fast forward on the corporate cycle? So they become systemically important much faster. Then they become incumbents much faster. Now they face competition much faster than you would expect. And isn't the right response to that is to step up investment? Isn't the right response to that to continually try to self-disrupt?
So I completely, Mohammed, agree with the fact that they should be spending and spending aggressively. They're hiring people. Engineers was one of the biggest expense items that they indicated. But they're also spending on the next generation of technology innovation, whether it's machine learning or AI. They talked about the cloud. These are the investments you want this company making. I completely agree with that. And when you have $110 billion in cash and investments, you can do that. So to be honest, I think this is just kind of a pause in a positive story.
But what evidence do we have, to go back to what Andrew was saying, what evidence do we have that they've misspent, that they're spent on the wrong things?
Right. Well, I think it's fair to say that when they talk about some of the areas of spending, right, so they talk about hardware, they've had a lot more misses than hits in the hardware area, I would argue. Now, you could say, well, they're spending on hardware because they want to prove out the capabilities of their software and services. Fine. But that's kind of a longer-term story. So what I would say is they're spending. They've obviously been supporting the growth story, but they've obviously had some mixed successes in areas, and I would point to hardware specifically.
It's interesting you say that because you could have been talking about Amazon, but investors give Amazon the long leash, right? To do that, even though Amazon's core business, if you consider it retail, is less profitable than Google's.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons that we like Alphabet as a story and as an investment opportunity, right? It trades at a low 20s multiple on 2019 estimates, and the growth rate, even in this quarter, was 22%.
So we've had people come on and say, look, this is a value play, but the question is, what's the inflection point that investors, broader investors, are going to assign a higher multiple?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, Andrew. I wish I did. I do think it's a value play, especially if you look at the broader FANG universe. I don't think there's any question about that. I think what people have been wondering about, as you pointed out, is at what point do you see that growth rate start to decelerate because of the competition that you alluded to? We haven't seen that, and we don't see any signs of that. And I think that's one of the reasons that people should be more opportunistic with this stock than perhaps some of the others.
Now, relative to Facebook, it's actually more expensive relative to Facebook than it has been in recent years.
Right. So Facebook obviously is a very different kind of story, given what they talked about in the middle of last year in terms of the expense ramp. But that story is a lot more intact than I think people expected as well. And we actually upgraded the stock in the fall of last year, in part because of the disconnect that we saw between the fundamentals and the perception in the marketplace.